He was 45, a former Navy SEAL, driving alone through a Wyoming blizzard with nothing left to go home to. No plan, no hope. Then through the wall of snow, he saw them. A freezing German shepherd curled around two newborn puppies, their bodies going still in the cold. No one stops on that road. But he did. When he opened his truck door and reached out his hand, the storm roared louder, the lights went out, and everything disappeared into white. 3 lives, 1 broken man. What happened next would test his past, his faith, and whether some souls are meant to be saved together or lost forever. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The Wyoming mountains disappeared beneath a white roar as the blizzard swallowed the highway wind, screaming across frozen asphalt like it meant to erase every living thing that dared to move. Michael Turner drove with both hands locked on the steering wheel of his aging pickup, the engine humming low beneath the storm, the wipers fighting a losing battle against sheets of ice and snow. He was 45 tall and broad-shouldered, built the way men are shaped by years of discipline rather than comfort. His dark brown hair was streaked heavily with gray at the temples, his beard trimmed short but uneven, the kind that came from habit rather than care. Deep lines cut into his weathered face, especially around the eyes where a permanent tension lived, as if he were always bracing for impact. He wore a thick, dark brown leather jacket, cracked and softened by age, a red and navy flannel beneath it, faded jeans, worn pale at the knees, cold-resistant leather boots, and a gray wool scarf pulled high to shield his face from the biting wind. He looked like a man carved out of winter itself. Mike had no destination. He hadn't for a long time. Since the night his wife died on an icy road not unlike this one, something inside him had gone quiet. The world kept moving, but he had stopped believing it needed him to follow. Once men had trusted him with their lives. Once his voice had cut through gunfire and chaos. Navy SEAL, team leader, protector. Now he was just a man driving through a storm, hoping the road would decide when he was done. The highway curved sharply ahead, a dangerous stretch locals avoided when the weather turned. Mike slowed out of instinct rather than caution. That was when he saw it. A shape darker than the snow, barely visible through the swirling white. At first he thought it was debris, maybe a fallen branch or a chunk of ice thrown from a truck. Then it moved. Low, shaking, alive. His breath caught. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding before coming to a stop in a soft, ominous crunch. The storm howled louder, as if angered by his hesitation. Mike sat frozen for a moment, staring through the windshield. No one stopped on this road. Everyone knew that. If you pulled over in a Wyoming blizzard, you risked becoming part of it. His hand hovered near the gear shift. He could keep driving. No one would know. No one would blame him. That thought made his chest tighten in a way he recognized too well. He cursed under his breath, shoved the door open and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a blade. Snow slammed into his face, clung to his beard, soaked into his jacket. His boots sank deep as he approached the shape by the roadside. It was a German shepherd. A female. Large but painfully thin, her blackened tan fur stiff with ice clumped and crusted from hours in the storm. She was curled around 2 impossibly small shapes tucked against her chest. Puppies. Newborns. Their tiny bodies trembled weakly, their breaths so shallow Mike had to strain to see their ribs move. The dog lifted her head when he crouched. Her amber eyes locked onto his wide and exhausted, filled not with aggression, but something far more dangerous to a man like him, pleading. One ear drooped slightly, the other pinned back, her body tense but unmoving. She didn't growl. She didn't bare her teeth. She simply watched him, every instinct torn between fear and the need to protect what little life remained beneath her. Mike swallowed hard. His gloved hands shook, and not from the cold. The sight ripped open a memory he kept buried. Another winter. Another road. His wife in the passenger seat laughing softly before the tires lost traction. The sound of metal screaming. The silence afterward. Her face pale against the snow as he held her helpless, begging her to stay. He had failed then. He had driven away from that moment every day since. He knelt slowly, lowering himself to the dog's level snow soaking into his jeans. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough, unused to kindness. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words felt foreign in his mouth. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon or a tool, but simply to steady his breathing. The wind roared around them, carrying the smell of pine and frozen earth. One of the puppies let out a sound so faint it barely existed a breath more than a cry. Mike extended his hand, palm-open fingers stiff with cold. He hesitated inches away from the dog's nose. He knew this moment. The space between trust and disaster. He had lived there his whole life. The dog stared at his hand, her body trembling, snow gathering on her back like a burial shroud. Then slowly she leaned forward. Her nose touched his fingers. Cold, wet, real. Something inside Mike cracked. The storm seemed to surge, the wind screaming louder as if protesting the fragile connection forming in its path. His throat tightened, his vision blurring. "I've got you," he whispered more to himself than to her. "You're not alone." That was when the lights died. The truck's headlights flickered once, then vanished. Darkness swallowed the road, the trees, the man kneeling in the snow, and the dog clinging to her pups. The wind howled like a living thing, snow falling thicker, faster, erasing edges and distance, until there was nothing but white and sound. Mike felt the cold deepen, felt the storm close around them like a closing fist. He reached instinctively for the dog again, for the small, fragile warmth beneath her. And then nothing was visible at all. No one knew what happened next. No one could say whether the man, or the dog, or the two newborn lives would survive the night. The storm kept its secrets, and the Wyoming highway swallowed them whole. Morning crept into the Wyoming mountains beneath a pale gray sky, the storm retreating into silence, as if it had exhausted itself during the night. Michael Turner woke on the cabin floor beside the hearth, his body stiff as boots, still on the smell of smoke and pine thick in the air. For a brief, disorienting second, he thought the night had been a dream. Then he heard it. Breathing. Soft, uneven, fragile. He pushed himself upright, joints aching, and looked toward the fire. The flames still burned low and steady. Near the hearth, wrapped in old wool blankets and one of his spare flannel shirts, lay the German shepherd. She was conscious, her amber eyes half open, tracking his movement with wary intelligence. Pressed against her belly were two impossibly small puppies, their tiny bodies rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Relief hit Mike so hard it made him dizzy. 3 lives. Still here. He moved closer, slow and deliberate. In the daylight, the dog looked worse than he'd realized in the storm. She was young, maybe 4 or 5 years old, but exhaustion had carved years into her posture. Her ribs were visible beneath her thick black and tan coat, now thawed but matted. One ear bore a small tear, old and healed, wrong a reminder of a life that hadn't been gentle. Still there was strength in her gaze, the kind that refused to surrender even when the body failed. "You made it," Mike murmured. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You're safe." The words felt dangerous, Promises always did. He crouched beside her and gently checked the puppies. One was slightly larger with lighter markings on its paws, the other darker and thinner, both no more than a few days old. They squeaked faintly when he adjusted the blankets, then settled again. Mike exhaled slowly. He hadn't felt this kind of fear since Afghanistan, since nights when he counted breaths instead of minutes. Names surfaced without effort, as if they'd been waiting. He didn't question it. He never questioned instinct anymore. "Grace," he said softly to the mother. The word felt strange on his tongue, heavy with meaning. Grace. Something given when it wasn't deserved. Something he'd stopped believing in years ago. The dog's ears twitched at the sound. He smiled faintly. "And you too?" he added, glancing at the pups, Jack and Lily. Simple. Solid. Names that belonged to life, not loss. The cabin had never sounded so loud in its quiet. The steady crackle of the fire. The whisper of breath. The place had been built as a refuge, once a hunting cabin meant for laughter and stories. After his wife died, it became a waiting room for the end. He cooked less, spoke to no one. Some nights he didn't light the fire at all. Now the room held something fragile and demanding, something that refused to be ignored. The memories came anyway. They always did. Heat shimmer over sand. The smell of burned metal. The weight of a wounded teammate collapsing against him, blood slicking his hands as he dragged the man to cover. He remembered the moment he'd failed to be fast enough, the sound that followed him home in his sleep. And then the road. Ice. Headlights spinning. His wife's hand slipping from his grip as snow fell onto her still face. Mike pressed his palms together, grounding himself. He was no good to them like this. Grace shifted a low whine escaping her throat. When he touched her flank, he felt it immediately. Heat. Too much. His stomach tightened. Infection. The storm hadn't been the only thing trying to kill her. He moved fast, then old training taking over. He fetched water, checked what little medical supplies he kept for himself. It wasn't enough. He knew that. His eyes went to the window toward the faint outline of another cabin further down the tree line. Margaret Collins lived there. She always had. Margaret was in her early 70s, short and slender, with steel-gray hair she kept pulled into a low bun and skin weathered by decades of mountain air. She wore thick sweaters year-round and walked with a slight stiffness that came from old injuries and newer grief. Her husband had died of cancer years earlier. Her son Daniel, a U.S. Army sergeant, never came home from his second deployment. Loss had settled into her bones, but it hadn't hardened her. It had made her precise, careful, kind in a way that didn't ask permission. Mike hadn't spoken to her much beyond polite nods and the occasional wave. He hadn't trusted himself with more. But he trusted her now with something far more important than conversation. The walk to her house felt longer than it was. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the cold biting but manageable. Margaret answered the door before he could knock twice. She took one look at his face and knew. "Come in," she said immediately, her voice steady, no questions yet. When he told her about Grace, about the puppies, about the fever, Margaret moved without hesitation. She grabbed her coat, a worn medical bag she'd kept since volunteering as a nurse decades earlier, and followed him back through the snow. Inside the cabin, she knelt beside Grace, her hands gentle but efficient, checking Gum's temperature breathing. "She's strong," Margaret said quietly, "but she's been fighting too long on her own." Mike watched as she cleaned the wound, hidden beneath matted fur, administered antibiotics cooled. Grace gradually, whispering softly as she worked. He had seen medics do worse in worse conditions, but this felt heavier. Personal. When Margaret finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You did the right thing," she said. Mike didn't answer. He stared at the fire, at the dog, breathing more evenly now, at the two puppies pressed close to their mother's warmth. Right and wrong had stopped being simple a long time ago. Margaret stayed until the worst of the fever broke. They spoke little. They didn't need to. Two people who had buried too much knew how to share silence. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. "This house doesn't have to stay quiet forever," she said gently. "Not if you don't want it to." After she left, the cabin settled again. Mike sat on the floor beside Grace, his back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him. Grace's eyes met his. This time there was less fear in them, still caution, but something else too. Trust thin as ice but holding. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, 3 lives slept, and for the first time in years, Michael Turner did not feel completely alone. Cold daylight settled over the Wyoming forest like a held breath, the snow crusted hard and bright beneath a sky the color of steel. Michael Turner stood on his porch leather jacket, pulled tight gray wool scarf wrapped high against his jaw, watching steam rise from his coffee mug as Grace lay near the threshold with Jack and Lily pressed against her side. The storm had passed, but the quiet that followed felt more dangerous than the wind had been. Mike had learned to recognize that silence. It was the kind that came before orders, before consequences. His shoulders remained squared, even now, posture ingrained by decades of training, but inside him something stayed coiled and alert. Grace lifted her head when she sensed it too. Ears twitching, amber eyes tracking the tree line beyond the cabin. She was stronger than she'd been days ago, her fever broken her movements steadier, but the wild edge in her gaze had not faded. Survival had etched itself deep into her instincts. The sound of tires crunching over packed snow cut through the stillness. Mike turned slowly as a dark green state truck pulled into the clearing, the Wyoming emblem stark against the white landscape. A man stepped out tall and broad, moving with the controlled efficiency of someone accustomed to authority. He removed his gloves before approaching, revealing large hands scarred by cold and work rather than combat. "Michael Turner," the man called. His voice was calm, measured. "That's me." Mike replied, his tone neutral. The man extended a badge. "Officer Daniel Brooks, Wyoming State Wildlife." Brooks appeared to be in his late 40s, his face angular and weathered with a short-cropped beard dusted with gray and eyes the pale blue of winter ice. He wore his uniform neatly, not stiff, but deliberate, the look of someone who believed in rules, because rules had once saved him from chaos. Mike nodded once. He didn't invite the man inside. He never did. Brooks's gaze moved past him, settling on Grace. His posture changed subtly, weight, shifting back one hand, lowering toward his belt out of habit. Grace rose to her feet at the same moment, body positioning itself between the officer and her pups. A low sound vibrated in her chest, not quite a growl, but close enough to carry meaning. "She yours?" Brooks asked. "She's not wild," Mike answered immediately. "Found her during the blizzard. She was freezing. Puppies, too." Brooks crouched slightly, studying Grace with a professional eye. "German shepherds don't usually give birth out here unless they've been abandoned or they're part wolf. We've had reports of hybrids in this region. Unregistered animals near protected land have to be evaluated." Mike felt heat rise behind his ribs. "She's domestic," he said. "Look at her. She trusts people." Brooks glanced at him. "She trusts you." The distinction landed hard. Mike clenched his jaw. He had lived his whole life being the exception. The one soldiers trusted when no one else could help them. He knew how fragile that line was. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Brooks' continued voice steady. "But protocol is protocol. I need to take her in. Temporary hold. just to verify." Grace's ears flattened. Her body stiffened. Mike saw it then, the instant her instincts shifted, the calculation behind her eyes. This wasn't a man offering help. This was a threat to her pack. "No," Mike said, stepping forward before he could stop himself. "You're not taking her." Brooks straightened his expression, firm, but not unkind. "Mr. Turner, I don't want to escalate this." Grace moved first. It happened so fast, Mike barely processed it. One sharp bark, sudden and commanding, and Grace nudged Jack and Lily forward with her nose. The puppies tumbled awkwardly through the snow, squeaking in protest. Grace turned her body, low muscles coiled, and bolted toward the trees. Mike shouted. The forest swallowed them almost instantly. Black and tan vanished into white and shadow. Paw prints scattered across the snow, already beginning to blur as wind picked up again. Brooks swore under his breath. Damn it. Mike didn't hear him. The sound that filled his ears wasn't the wind or the officer's voice. It was memory. Another moment of hesitation. Another life slipping away because someone else had decided what was allowed. His chest hollowed out the same implosion he'd felt standing beside a road years ago, staring at headlights that never came back. He ran. Mike grabbed his flashlight from the hook by the door, shrugged into his jacket, wrapped the scarf tight, and plunged into the trees without thinking. Snow swallowed his boots as he followed the fading tracks, heart-pounding breath tearing at his lungs. "Grace!" he yelled, his voice cracking against the branches. "Grace, come back." The forest closed around him, dark and unfamiliar, despite how many times he'd hunted these trails. The wind rose, carrying his voice away, scattering it like ash. The beam of his flashlight cut narrow paths through the snow-laden pines, illuminating nothing but white and fear. Behind him, Brooks shouted something, his name maybe, but Mike didn't turn back. He couldn't. The fear inside him had a shape now sharp and urgent. Losing them wasn't an option. He had lived that ending already. He pushed deeper, calling her name again and again, each shout a plea, each step a refusal to accept the familiar outcome. Grace's tracks split, circled, vanished beneath drifting snow. Jack and Lily's smaller prints appeared and disappeared like ghosts. "Hold on, Mike," whispered voice, hoarse. "Please." The cold burned his lungs. His shoulder throbbed, an old injury flaring under strain. But he kept moving because stopping meant surrender, and surrender had cost him everything once before. Somewhere ahead a branch snapped. Or maybe it was just the forest answering him. Mike slowed, heart-hammering flashlight sweeping the darkness. Snow fell heavier now, thick and relentless, erasing the ground behind him. Grace did not answer, and the forest offered no mercy. Night tightened its grip on the Wyoming forest as snow began to fall again. Light at first, then thicker, swallowing sound and distance beneath a rising wind. Michael Turner moved through the trees with his flashlight, clenched tight breath tearing at his lungs, boots punching deep into drifts that seemed determined to slow him down. His leather jacket creaked with every step, stiff with cold, the gray wool scarf frozen damp against his throat. The forest no longer felt familiar. It felt deliberate, as if it were testing him. Mike followed what little remained of the tracks, 3 sets at first, then only 1. His heart hammered as fear sharpened into something older, something trained. He forced his breathing into rhythm, counting steps the way he used to on night patrols, letting discipline carry him where emotion threatened to drown him. Losing Grace and the puppies wasn't just another loss. It was a reopening of a wound he had never allowed to close. He could not survive that again. The sound reached him before the sight. A faint, broken whimper carried on the wind, fragile but unmistakably alive. Mike froze, sweeping the beam of his flashlight across the darkness. "Grace," he called softer now, careful not to spook her. "It's me. I'm here." The light caught the edge of the ravine. A jagged cut in the earth, half hidden by snow and ice, plunging steeply into shadow. His stomach dropped. He edged closer, kneeling at the rim. The beam dipped downward, and there they were. Grace lay wedged against the frozen wall nearly 20 feet below, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. One hind leg was bent wrong, useless dark blood staining the snow beneath her. Despite the pain, she had curled herself around Jack and Lily, her body forming a living shield against the cold stone. The puppies stirred weakly beneath her chest, tiny movements that meant everything. Mike's chest constricted. "You stubborn girl," he whispered, voice breaking. He scanned the ravine, searching for a safe path down. There was none. The walls were slick with ice, the slope too steep for anything but a controlled descent. His shoulder throbbed in warning, the old injury flaring with the memory of past climbs and heavier weights. He ignored it. He had ignored worse. He shrugged off his pack and pulled out the coil of rope he kept rolled tight at the bottom, a remnant from his military days he'd never quite been able to throw away. His hands moved with practiced certainty as he secured one end around the thick trunk of a pine, testing the knot twice. "Hold on," he murmured, whether to Grace or himself he didn't know. "I've got you." The descent was brutal. Snow gave way beneath his boots, sending him sliding before the rope snapped, taut, jolting pain through his shoulder and down his spine. He gritted his teeth, breathing through it, inching lower, muscles burning as ice cut into his gloves. Halfway down, Grace lifted her head and barked once, weak but urgent, as if warning him not to fall. The sound steadied him more than any command ever had. When his boots finally hit the ravine floor, Mike dropped to his knees beside her. Up close, Grace looked worse. Her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, her eyes glassy but focused, never leaving her pups. "You did good," he said hoarsely, pressing his forehead briefly to hers. "You did everything right." He moved quickly. The puppies first. He opened his jacket, tucking Jack and Lily inside against his chest, wrapping them in an emergency blanket from his pack. Their tiny bodies trembled violently, but they were alive. That was enough. Then Grace. She tried to rise when he slid an arm beneath her chest, but her leg collapsed beneath her weight. She whimpered a sound that tore through him. "I know," he whispered. "I know. I'm sorry." The climb back up was worse. With one arm gripping the rope and the other supporting Grace's weight, every pull sent fire through his shoulder. Snow fell harder now, coating his eyelashes, blurring his vision. Twice his boot slipped showering ice down the ravine. He kept going because stopping wasn't an option. He could feel Grace's heartbeat against him, could hear the faint sounds the puppies made inside his jacket. Each sound was a reason. A light appeared above, stronger than his own. A voice cut through the wind. "Turner, hold tight." Mike squinted upward. Officer Daniel Brooks stood at the edge of the ravine, snow whipping around his broad frame. The officer had anchored himself to another tree rope already in hand, his expression tight with focus rather than authority. Without hesitation, Brooks began lowering his line, coordinating their movements with short, efficient commands. Together, they hauled. Mike pushed upward with everything he had left while Brooks pulled from above, boots planted, teeth-clenched shoulders straining. When Mike finally reached the rim, both men collapsed onto the snow, gasping, muscles shaking from exhaustion. Grace lay between them, still breathing, her head resting briefly against Mike's chest. For a long moment, Brooks said nothing. He watched the dog, the bloodied leg, the two small shapes stirring beneath Mike's jacket. Something shifted in his expression, the rigid line of protocol softening into something human. "You risked your life for them," Brooks said quietly. Mike wiped frost from his beard. "They're my family." Brooks nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that." He pulled off his jacket and draped it over Grace without being asked. "Let's get them home." The walk back felt unreal. Dawn crept into the sky by the time they reached the cabin, painting the snow in pale gold. Margaret Collins waited on the porch, wrapped in a thick coat, hands clasped tight. When she saw Mike emerge from the trees carrying Grace, her breath caught tears spilling freely. Inside, they laid Grace near the hearth. Margaret worked immediately, her movements steady, despite the urgency, cleaning the wound, stabilizing the leg, murmuring reassurances that sounded like prayers. Brooks stood back, watching his hat clenched in his hands. When it was done, Grace's breathing slowed, evened out. Jack and Lily slept warm and safe. Brooks cleared his throat. "I'll file my report," he said. "It'll say you rescued a domestic dog and her litter from a ravine. That's all." He met Mike's eyes. "Sometimes the rules forget what they're meant to protect." Mike nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the sun rose over Wyoming, and the storm finally let go. Spring arrived quietly in the Wyoming mountains, melting the last of winter into thin streams that traced the land like veins waking from sleep. Michael Turner stood outside his cabin watching sunlight break across the snowfields, the air carrying the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. The cabin no longer felt like a place meant to hold a single man's grief. Over the months, Mike had rebuilt it piece by piece, not to erase what it once was, but to give it a new purpose. The rough porch had been widened. The old shed had been converted into a heated kennel. Fences now traced the clearing with deliberate care. Mike worked every day until his hand split and healed again, because labor gave shape to the quiet thoughts that once tried to drown him. Grace watched from the porch as he worked her black and tan coat, catching the sun. Her leg had healed poorly, leaving her with a slight limp, but it did not slow her authority. She moved with calm certainty, ears alert, eyes steady. Jack and Lily, no longer the trembling newborns he had found in the snow, chased each other through the yard, with reckless joy, their bodies strong and full of life. Mike often paused to watch them, a hand resting unconsciously against his chest, as if confirming his own heartbeat still existed. People began to come. Not crowds, not at first. A former Marine with haunted eyes and a scar that ran from ear to jaw. A retired police handler whose canine partner refused to eat after retirement. Men and women who spoke little, but understood silence too well. Mike never asked for their stories. He simply offered space routine and the steady presence of dogs who knew what it meant to serve and survive. The place earned a name without ceremony, a refuge, a haven, a reason. Grace became the heart of it all. New dogs followed her lead, instinctively drawn to her quiet strength. When a young Belgian Malinois refused food for days, Grace lay beside him until he ate. When a veteran woke screaming from a nightmare, Grace sat at his feet, breathing slow and steady, grounding him back into the present. Mike watched these moments unfold with awe and humility. He had once believed leadership came from command. Grace showed him it came from endurance and trust. Margaret Collins visited nearly every day. She kept records, organized supplies, brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead. At 73, she moved slower, but her mind was sharp, her presence unwavering. She had found her own purpose again, helping tend to creatures that reminded her of her son, loyal, brave, and quietly wounded. Sometimes she and Mike would sit together at dusk, watching the dogs settle, speaking little. They did not need words for what they shared. Officer Daniel Brooks made the arrangement official. He arrived one afternoon with paperwork tucked beneath his arm, his uniform jacket open, his posture less rigid than it once had been. The lines in his face had softened, as if carrying this responsibility felt lighter than enforcing rules that left no room for mercy. He became the haven's quiet guardian, the man who made sure no one came to take what had been earned through blood and persistence. Time moved the way it always does. Too fast when you are not ready. Grace began to slow. Her muzzle grayed, her steps shortened, her breaths heavier after even brief exertion. Mike noticed before anyone else. He adjusted routines without comment. Shorter walks, longer rests, softer words spoken low and close. He brushed her coat each evening, fingers memorizing the shape of her skull, the warmth beneath her fur. One morning, under a sky washed pale blue, Mike opened the gate to the old field beyond the trees. Snow still lingered there in soft drifts, untouched and quiet. Grace stood beside him, tail swaying gently. Jack and Lily bounded ahead, stopping every few steps to look back, waiting for her. Mike knelt, resting a hand against Grace's shoulder. "This is where we met," he said softly. "In the storm." Grace turned her head toward him. Her amber eyes were calm, clear, unafraid. There was no confusion in them, only understanding. Mike swallowed hard. The ache in his chest was familiar, but different now. Not the sharp, tearing grief of before. This was something gentler, something earned. He stood and stepped back. "Go on," he whispered. Grace hesitated only a moment. Then she moved forward, her gait uneven at first, then steadier, as if remembering something older than pain. Jack and Lily fell into step beside her, their bodies brushing against hers as they crossed the field together. Halfway across, Grace stopped. She turned once, looking back at Mike, for a breathless second time, held still. Mike lifted his hand, the same one he had extended in the blizzard long ago. "Thank you," he said. His voice did not break. Grace turned and continued on, the three of them moving into the white and gold of the open land until they became silhouettes against the light. Then they were gone. That night the haven was quiet, not empty. Quiet in the way a church is quiet after prayer. Mike sat alone near the hearth, the fire low and steady. He thought of the man he had been driving through a storm with nothing left to lose. He thought of the hand he had extended, not knowing it would save him too. Sometimes he realized God does not still the storm. Sometimes he places a fragile life directly in your path and waits to see if you will stop. Mike bowed his head, not in despair, but in gratitude. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, warmth remained. Sometimes God does not remove the storm from our lives. Instead, he places something fragile in our path and waits to see whether we will stop, whether we will choose compassion over fear. Michael did not find a miracle in the snow that night. He became part of one. By saving a broken family, he discovered that healing often comes not from forgetting our pain, but from allowing love to give that pain meaning. In our daily lives, we all face moments when it would be easier to keep driving, to look away, to protect ourselves from feeling too much. But faith reminds us that even the smallest act of mercy can change a destiny, sometimes our own. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, guide you through every storm, and keep your heart warm wherever you are.